From Buffalo Toronto Public Media and WBFO, this is Buffalo What's Next, Producer's Picks. Important interviews you may have missed from our daily discussion on race, segregation, and our shared humanity. Today, heart-wrenching stories on the troubled history of Native American residential boarding schools.
It took me 8 hours first of crying just to read through my mother's file the first time I read it.
Fighting for funding. Hear from community health groups worried about a shortfall coming in April.
This carve-out only impacts that safety net. We're talking about communities of color, people living with HIV, LGBT folks.
Activist Alex Burgos.
We need to have lifelong investment in our community, but also in the people in our community.
And Bishop Michael Badger from Bethesda World Harvest International, all coming up on today's program. I'm Jay Moran. Thanks for being with us. We begin with Dr. Lori Quigley, the interim president of Medaille University, a member of the Seneca Nation Wolf Clan, and a researcher into the history of residential boarding schools for Native Americans in Western New York. I want to start off with a question that I finished with Dr. Jason Corwin yesterday from the University of Buffalo Indigenous Studies Department. When, and I didn't say if, but I said when the greater American society comes to understanding indigenous populations, what's the hope? What's the optimism? What are we going to see when we as a society get there? Because
I would say that for me personally, if the American public could just acknowledge, number one, our current existence, and number two, the history that we have from our perspective. I don't really think that we really in this country have acknowledged that from our perspective, we see Thanksgiving as something different. From our perspective, land loss, okay, and what that has done. From our perspective, the residential boarding school era that, as far as I know, no other, racial ethnic group in this country has ever gone through. And, the generational impact that has left on our communities to this day. The importance for us of maintaining our indigenous languages, of maintaining our sovereign territories is huge. And I don't think that the American public can really fully appreciate and understand that yet.
I want to get into boarding schools, so I'm going to kind of
Sure.
warn our listeners perhaps to be prepared for an emotional journey here coming up. I've spent a lot of time researching boarding schools.
Yes. My mother was a survivor of Thomas Indian School, and we do refer to those who made it as survivors, okay? But what I could see in my own Native community, and as I was also a young mother, the multi-generational impact, the traumatic impact that still exists in our communities today, and I wanted to learn more about what actually happened.
Right.
What happened at Thomas Indian School. And as I was beginning my research, a professor, Dr. Lawrence Hopman from SUNY New Paltz, actually said to me that when the state closed Thomas Indian School in 1957, they actually shipped all the records, and they're housed in the New York State Archives. And I don't think anybody knew that. Certainly all the survivors that I've talked to from Thomas Indian School did not know that there were even records kept. And when you go to the archives, there are two groups of archival materials. One is for the public. Anybody can go and take a look at the superintendent's reports, the school newsletters, records that were kept by the food staff, all of that. That's for public. But what records that individuals didn't even know, my mother never knew existed, were sealed case files. So when New York State took it over, at the time it was the New York State Board of Charities, I believe is when they started keeping records of all the children who lived there. And the children who lived there, they weren't just from Seneca. They were from all the tribal nations across New York State, all the 6 nations, plus the 2 Long Island tribes. And I don't think people realize
So children
that.
from Long Island were brought
Yes,
up to Western New York.
The Shinnecox, the Poospatucks, yes. And I was able to get permission from 20 survivors to open up their sealed case files. And they're quite personal. And what I learned is each person's story is different as to how they got there.
Okay.
My mother never really knew how she got there.
What age was she when she got there?
She was 5 years old.
Okay.
She was there for 10 years. And, all the records are different. I discovered that some Tuscaroras that I had interviewed were placed there after their parents had been killed, and right from the funeral gravesite, they were taken down there. Okay. Every story is different.
Okay.
All right.
Would you like to expand on your mother's story for us?
For my mother's story, my mother was placed in foster care, and she always kept in touch with her foster parents because they really wanted to keep her, but for whatever reason, the state deemed that it would be best to put her in Thomas Indian School. So she ended up
Who made those kind of decisions?
somebody working in the state.
Somebody had that kind of power.
Yes, and I would say that the social worker, Frances Kincaid, who was hired by Thomas Indian School, in my opinion, had more power over the children's lives than the superintendent did in her decision-making. And you can actually see it in the communications and in what she wrote about my mother that's in my mother's case file. For example, my mother's great-aunt Betty never went to Thomas Indian School, never had her own children, but she adopted children. And my mother could never figure out, why didn't you come adopt me? Well, by the time I had opened up my mother's case file, my great-aunt had passed away, but I found in there communication from my aunt to Frances Kincaid asking if she could take my mom and adopt her. And for whatever reason, Frances Kincaid made the decision, no, you cannot. But my mother never knew that, and I think my mother always held it against my aunt for adopting other children, but not her. But the answers were right there in that file through those letter exchanges. And there's more of my mother's unanswered questions that were answered by documents in that file and everything that happened to my mother. My mother never understood why she was selected with other girls her age, at the age of 15, to leave Thomas Indian School and go work in what was called wage homes for affluent families.
Wage homes?
Yes, my mother was actually placed in a wage home, which is the mansion that is currently used and owned by SUNY Fredonia for their president's house. And she was placed there as a maid at the age of 15 without permission of her family. In fact, her extended family took them a while to figure out where the school had placed her. It was a horrible experience for my mom. My mom passed away in August, and a couple of years before she was placed in a nursing home, my mother asked if I would take her back to that home. I said, you know where that home is? She goes, yes, it's the home of the SUNY Fredonia president. And we went through the front door and learned that was the first time she was ever allowed to walk in the front door, because she was only allowed to walk in the back door of the butler's area. They also built a bathroom for her. So if you remember that movie, The Help, about the African-American woman working where they built them a separate bathroom, same thing happened in that big mansion for my mother. She lived in one of the attics. She was never allowed to dine with the family.
And she had no choice.
She had no choice. And some really severe things happened with her there in that family. And totally felt isolated and unloved. I think at one point, one Christmas, the way my mother told the stories, I believe that it was at that point in time where she felt so alone that, I think suicide definitely crossed her mind. She talks about it, okay? And I think that whole visit was a way of my mom trying to reconcile with what happened to her. And it was a Methodist minister that my mother finally turned to and asked for help to get her out of that place. So
how long was she there?
She was there for 2 years.
So from 15 to 17.
Yes.
She was forced to live and work in a place she had no choice in.
Yes, exactly. And you know what I discovered in her file? The money that she earned went back to the school, because the receipts are all in there. The detailed receipts are in my mother's case file. So when my mother finally was able to get into Alfred, she went to Alfred State, and she paid her way by working in the registrar's office. There's a letter that she wrote during that time back to Frances Kincaid asking her for money because she needed a winter coat. She needed sanitary supplies as a young woman. And Frances Kincaid wrote back and denied her that. I'd like to know, where's all that money that my mother was never able to get? How come it went back to the school? And that's just one example, again, of many. Other horrific things that happened medically to, some of the individuals that I took a look at in their files.
And when you say medically, are we kind of stretching the use of the term there?
Yeah. What's interesting is that there's little cards that the state had where you would have to sign off the parents' permission, but the handwriting on all of them is the same. So that leads you to be a little suspicious. And, some of the things that happened to the children at that time and what they went through, whether they were being used as guinea pigs or whatever. I think often, when I talk to a lot of the survivors, and many of them are no longer living today, They were definitely convinced that they were used as guinea pigs for vaccinations, etc. And you can see, some of the operations that they had. There was no parental permission. When they lived there, they were also isolated from their siblings. They were also isolated from families. And there was a lot of heartache and not understanding why families never came to visit, why they were never allowed to go visit families.
They were not allowed to go
They
visit.
weren't. No, even those that happened in my mother's case too, where a great auntie who lived on the west side of Buffalo wanted to have my mother come up for Christmas. She made the mistake of writing to my mother first that she was going to ask Frances Kincaid. Okay, and if you put all the pieces together with the dates of the letter, Frances Kincaid was not happy that her great auntie had asked my mother first before she asked Miss Kincaid. And Frances Kincaid in her letter back to my mother said, well, she hasn't been behaving. Well, then I looked at the anecdotal records, and Frances Kincaid was great at writing anecdotal records. There was nothing behaviorally wrong noted in my mother's records at that period of time. Okay. And yet that was the excuse that she used for not allowing her to go. And she says, it's too bad that you didn't ask me first. She starts the letter out that way. So I said, well, that's the reason that she chose, not that my mother was having behavioral issues in the girls' dormitory, because the anecdotal records prove that she wasn't.
Wow.
Yeah. So it took me 8 hours first of crying just to read through my mother's file the first time I read it. And then hours afterwards of sifting through and analyzing and putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And I did the same for many other families. Some of the families asked me for copies of their files, and others, I don't think they just don't want to see what's in there.
You're outlining some horrific realities here. It was located on what is now Route 438.
Route 438 between Gowanda and Irving on Seneca Nation territory. After following the Buffalo Creek Treaty, when the Senecas were forced to all go back down to Cattaraugus, the missionaries, Laura and Asher Wright, who were Presbyterian, moved their mission back down there. And I believe at that time, I think they probably had, good intentions of helping the children and the families out, because there was such dire, stricken poverty, just rampant through the reservation at that time. And it was named after a Quaker benefactor, Philip Thomas, and that's where the name actually, came from. Thomas Indian School. Used to be Thomas Asylum for destitute and orphan children. All right, and the survivors always called it Salem as just as sort of a nickname. And then eventually it was taken over by the state of New York, and eventually in 1957, because of the conditions and the poor education of the children, they actually closed. They had to close the school. It was a decision that the governor at that time had made.
How long was it open?
It was open well over 100 years. So thousands of children actually attended there, either as residential schools and some as day students. And the experiences I've learned from the day students is quite different from those who actually lived there. I remember looking at one photo in the New York State Archives of the dormitory, and I had shown it to my mom. I said, is this exactly what it looked like, a bunch of beds? And she goes, yeah, that's exactly what it looked like. As she's describing it, she begins to unravel some stories. And one of the stories, she said, well, at night, we would wait for the matrons to go to bed. And sometimes we'd have fun and we'd jump on the beds and laugh, but we'd always get in trouble. But then there were many nights when you could just hear the girls crying, one girl crying there, because they were so lonely and they missed their families and not understanding what happened to them. I think for my mom, for my family, what's really difficult is that just prior to the pandemic, we had to put my mom in a nursing home because she began to get dementia. And which was hard, because anybody who was in a nursing home at that time, they just didn't understand what was going on. Okay, so I wasn't able to even see my mom for quite a number of months. And I was able then to visit her through windows, through, doorway, But I was contacted by the staff because they had concerns over my mom. And this is the story behind the concerns. I went to visit, my mom when we were talking through the glass doors, and she goes to me, Laura, you're not going to believe what happened to me. I said, what? Well, last night, those guys in the white coat, they took me outside, and they threw me against the brick wall of the building. And I thought, oh, my goodness, what kind of place have we put my mom in? And then it dawned on me after conversations with her, through her dreams, she was reliving in her dementia what happened to her at Thomas Indian School. And so I had to explain to the staff that no, she's not telling stories or lies about the staff. She's reliving what happened to her as a child. And because of her dementia, it's too hard for her to break apart, well, was this a dream or is this actual her reality right now in her state of dementia?
Sure.
So the saddest thing for my family is having known that my mother's life started in an institution and ended in an institution, and going through much of the same trauma that, we never knew she would go through and have repeated again because of her dementia.
And
Very, very sad.
Absolutely. And to hear that notion that, upon her dementia, she flashes back to those early years. Obviously, she was living with those memories
Yes,
throughout her life.
exactly.
How best can you understand how she coped?
I think she coped because many of the children there were told that they weren't going to be anything but a bunch of drunk Indians. They were told that.
They were told that.
And sadly for my mom and those that she lived with, for many of them, I think she could see it was becoming a reality. Certainly when I was, 12, 13, 14, she began taking me to funerals of people I didn't know, but there were people she lived with who that became a reality for them, a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. But for my mother, she said, I'll be damned if I'm going to let them tell me that this is what's going to happen to me. There's something in her, she doesn't know where it came from, that was set out to prove them wrong. And, when I talked about her files before, I noticed that Frances Kincaid kept track of my mom until she married my father. And my mother never knew she even did that, which is really interesting. But certainly I think that my mother would often tell, her 5 daughters, she'd say to us, I don't even know how I'm able to raise you. And I was never raised in a family environment. And she certainly ran our household like an institution. We had our chores. She posted them every week. We had to make our beds the military style, the way that they were taught. We had to iron, our clothes the way that she was taught because that's what they were taught,
Right.
as young women at Thomas Indian School. And she made sure that, the meals were sort of done a lot of the same. And but that's what she knew. That's what she grew up with. We didn't get the hugs, the kisses, the I love you because she didn't grow up with that. But
Right.
we knew our mom loved us, We knew, we learned, through conversations with her what happened. They were, if any of them were caught speaking the language, they were harshly and, severely punished for it. And it's really a sad testimony of what happened to people in what we would still call contemporary times.
Most certainly.
Seriously.
Yeah, no doubt. 1957
Yes,
is not all
exactly.
that long ago.
No, it's not.
So for 10 years of her life, she's had her heritage ripped away from her.
Yes.
The formative years for her. Did she return to some of that
That's
after it was
interesting.
over?
She actually ended up, after she married my father and they lived in the Dunkirk-Fredonia area, they actually moved to the reservation probably when I was about 4 years old. And interesting enough, my mother went back to what you would call home, My sisters and I, following my mother ended up going back, getting her Seneca name, which is Jagonya. She returns. Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
And, and we were all, went through longhouse ceremonies to get our names as well. But I think that there's something probably that happened to her and from her understanding that she always wanted to give back to her people. And so she worked for the Seneca Nation in different capacities for a number of years. She was also served as the Seneca Nation counselor. She also served as part of the Seneca lease negotiating team of the council when they renegotiated that. She spoke. It was her testimony in Congress that is still used at UB's Native Studies, Indigenous Studies program. So she certainly had an impact, and she was always giving back. And I think that's why probably I am the same way. My whole philosophy.
Yeah, I was just going to ask though.
Yeah.
I mean, did you find inspiration in your mother's
most
story?
Most definitely. And my mother and I were very close. My mother was the founder of New York State's Indian Education Association. I certainly chaired that association for 10 years, if not longer, and I'm still associated with that. And now at the national level, I've had presidential appointment to the National Advisory Council on Indian Education. I currently serve as ombudsperson for National Indian Education Association. So I would say that my mother had tremendous impact on me and my life and the direction that I went in.
And yet, she saw other examples of
Oh,
her
yeah.
schoolmates who didn't
Exactly.
have such
Yeah.
a fruitful existence, perhaps.
And I think that's probably why she became the person she became. She wanted to make sure that people could overcome that. Her way of giving back to community. She certainly helped out a lot of Native students in New York State at the higher ed level because she also went into higher education administration. She worked at St. Bonaventure for a number of years as their founding higher education opportunity program director. When she retired, she worked as a counselor, guidance counselor at Randolph Academy, which is a school district, if you will, that takes in children from across Western New York that aren't successful in other schools. And she fit in really well with those kids. And you can only imagine why.
Dr. Lori Quigley. Up next, Dave Debo talks with activist Alex Burgos.
Alex, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Little biographical stuff. If we can start with your origin story, as it were.
Well,
Buffalo born and bred?
born and raised, I was
Okay.
born in Sisters Hospital to my beautiful Puerto Rican family. Lifelong Buffalo resident, super proud, love my city, nowhere I'd rather be in the entire world. And so with that, I want to deliver resources. I want to bring about the change I want to see, and I want everybody in the city to have a better life.
Before the program started, we were chatting outside the studio briefly. You said that you knew from an early age that you were facing some sort of discrimination.
Absolutely. I think from when I was very young, I knew I was different
Okay.
in a multitude of ways. But I also think I knew I was different in a positive way because I knew I wasn't just going to sit around and look the other way and stand around. With that being said, the things that made me different that once hurt me and the things that I thought were weaknesses are things that I actually now see as my superpower.
And are you referring to, you're upfront, I'm not telling the world any secret here. You're a gay man and you're a Latino.
Yes.
Which one of those results in maybe more discrimination or more obstacles for you?
I think I have a very unique experience and perspective being both a person of color and a member of the LGBT community, in that I don't think that I can really choose one or the other. I think my whole existence,
It is you.
that's me.
Okay.
And from a very young age, I knew that my entire existence was heavily politicized and that people like me were always at the forefront of, negative policy change or legislative action. And I knew that from when I was 8 years old.
Really?
Yeah.
The politics portion of it at 8 years, that's interesting to me.
8, 9, 10, that was around the time when the 2008 presidential elections were on their way and people were name dropping themselves as candidates. And then eventually, as time went on, the first race that I fully paid attention to was the historic primary between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, and which eventually led to the historic victory of Barack Obama. So, I mean, I was not only, experiencing my first moment of being engaged, I was also witnessing history. And I think you're going to see that in a lot of younger millennials and Gen Z, that their first intro into maybe politics or activism occurred during moments that are profoundly historic.
That's interesting because I think the trope, the younger generation doesn't care. They're not active. They're not involved. Okay, yeah, there might have been that Bernie Sanders thing that fired people up, but by and large, they're not involved. That's the stereotype. Push back.
I don't think that's true. I mean, I'm always surrounded by young people who are absolutely brilliant and engaged and really want to be the change that they want to see in the community. I think there needs to be more investment in young people, in young leaders across the board, not just on the political spectrum, but we need to invest in our young nonprofit leaders. We need to invest in our young leaders in the private sector. We need to invest, again, in our young leaders emerging in politics, because eventually the time will come when they have big shoes to fill, and we need to make sure that they're ready, equipped, and prepared to hit the ground running.
It almost sounds like you're saying we don't have a deep enough bench, or we're not recognizing the power of the farm team.
Well, I think that there absolutely needs to be a bigger investment in younger leaders, and I'm very proud to be someone that does that and has done that for my entire career. I create a lot of community programming and events where youth are centered, and it's not very often especially in LGBT events, where you see that they are youth-centered and youth-specific.
Really?
Yes.
Interesting. I would not have known that.
No, and a lot of people don't, and I'm really happy to see, a lot greater investment happening in youth programming, as well as to be someone that creates that, particularly for the Black and Brown LGBTQ youth, by creating events like ballroom events.
I was going to ask you, give me an example of something you've created recently.
Oh my God, the one that everyone always talks about. In June for Pride Week, we had done the Intersect Vogue Night, which basically we had closed off Allen Street. We had a stage built, and we had ballroom categories for cash prizes and free tickets to Pride. We had about 500 people there, primarily Black and Brown LGBT people. So that's always an event that people always talk about, whether they saw it on Facebook Live or they saw it on an Instagram story or they see photos or videos. That's the one that everyone always mentions to me and asks me every single time, are you going to bring it back?
And of course, the answer is sure.
I hope so.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. You mentioned pride, and I want to point out a quote that you recently profiled on Channel 2. My dear friend Claudine Ewing, her community
She's
program.
Amazing.
She included this quote from the raising of the pride flag, where you said, homophobia, racism, and transphobia are a cultural malignancy. They are a trifecta of public health crisis that exacerbates the disparities that we face every single day. That's powerful stuff.
Thank you.
Talk a little bit about each one of those components, and as you said in that quote, how perhaps they work together as a trifecta. Homophobia, racism, transphobia. Do they all walk down the same street together?
They're definitely neighbors.
Okay.
In all seriousness, they are a branch, perhaps different branches of the same tree.
The same tree.
And ultimately, the only way to truly eradicate them is to dig out that tree, get out that root, and throw it away in an eco-friendly compost.
And an
But I always say that, a systemic problem requires a systemic solution. And, as someone that has worked in various capacities throughout the system, I recognize that the change that people want is not always a change that they get, or the delivery is not always the way they expect, but it is, in fact, a move in the right direction.
I've had a discussion on this program with a lot of different people that work in the public health arena. And it's interesting that you talk about the systemic nature of it, because there are some, and I know I've discussed this on the program before, there are some that say you got to just treat the health problem that's in front of you. If someone is in need, they have a need, you solve that need. The other philosophy is that this thing is, as you said, systemic, that you got to dig out the roots. How do you dig out a root? That seems to be a really tough row to hoe if we can continue with the gardening metaphors.
I think for me personally, being the change I want to see and stepping up and doing my part is what I do. I think folks can all contribute in various capacities, whether that be through voting, whether that be through activism, whether that be through working within said system. We need people across the board. And I think all activism is, for the most part, good and all intersects and intertwines very well. I also think that activism doesn't just have to be, what most people think of, like protesting or being on the media or whatever the case may be. If you're giving someone a safe space to just be themselves, if you're giving someone room to unwind and relax, if you're giving someone a place where they can talk and ask questions, that in itself is revolutionary and impactful.
Validating their voice or their perspective brings it to the debate in a way that you say is constructive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, when you are affirming someone, when you're building them up, you never know what future lies ahead of that person. You don't know the impact that you may have in the life of that person. I mean, let me tell you something. Even just a few years ago, I didn't think that I could have the level of influence or do the kind of work that I do now. And it took people who really believed in me, people who really instilled the resilience of human spirit and, all of that got me through. And so I live with that philosophy that because of that nurturing and that care and that affirmation that I got, I now have to pass that blessing on to other people.
Alexander Burgos. This is Buffalo What's Next Producers Picks, highlights from our recent daily discussion on WBFO. Still to come, Bishop Michael Badger. But first, a look at state funding fears for community health partners. Mike Lee, the COO of Evergreen Health, and Liza, one of their clients.
We speak on this program a lot about underserved communities, groups of people who don't, in this case, have adequate access to health care. And in Greater Buffalo, there are 4 healthcare providers that specifically work to help out that population. With us now is Mike Lee, the Chief Operating Officer for Evergreen Health. A little later, we'll chat with Liza, one of Evergreen's clients. But first, Mike, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
What is 340B? This is a program that exists now in Albany that gives you some of their funding?
What 340B is actually a federal program that allows certain covered entities like federally qualified health centers and Ryan White providers to get discounts on outpatient prescription drugs from manufacturers. So it's not necessarily funding a taxpayer-funded program. It is a discount that you get from drug manufacturers if you have a certain status.
How does that work, that the federal government is in a position to give a discount on behalf of a drug company?
So as part of drug manufacturers participating in the Medicare and Medicaid programs, one of the things that they have to allow is certain covered entities, again, that mainly safety net providers, to participate in this 340B program. So by virtue of them participating in the Medicaid, Medicare program, they also agree to participate in the 340B program and give discounts to safety net providers.
And where does the state come in? Thus far, we've talked about it as a federal program, but the reason I think that you folks want to speak out about it is because there's something pending at the state level.
Absolutely. So the state 3 years ago decided right now managed care plans administer the pharmacy benefit. So right now, if somebody comes in, managed care plan covers the pharmacy benefit. The state wanted to come in and take the pharmacy benefit out of those managed care plans and put them to fee for service. Not to get very technical, and I know it's kind of boring, but anytime the prescription drug benefit is removed from the managed care plans and given right over to fee for service to straight Medicaid, you have to bill acquisition pricing. So that means the federal government can only pay acquisition pricing.
Is that basically, if I was buying a car, that would be sticker price? Is that what you're saying?
So yes, that would be just the cost to make the car. So just to dumb it down sort of in a nutshell, the 340B program in the managed care plan, the manufacturer gives the covered entity like Evergreen the discount on the drugs. We then bill the payer the full price. So the difference between the discount and the reimbursed price, that delta, is what covered entities, safety net providers use to further patient care and services. So you get a discount from the manufacturer, you bill the insurance payer the full price, the retail for it, and then you keep the difference to pay for underserved populations.
So it's not just a discount on the pharmaceuticals, it's an operating revenue stream for you.
So it is. It is absolutely a source of revenue that a lot of safety net providers use. In fact, most of us here in Western New York absolutely depend on it.
And how is the state involved if it's a federal program? What sort of jeopardy is there for this program at the state level right now?
So the state has said, we're going to take that pharmacy benefit and we're going to move it out of the managed care plans. By law, the covered entities cannot bill straight Medicaid, the full retail cost of it. They have to just do acquisition pricing, which is the cost of the drug. So by doing that, what the state has done is they've taken the resources for themselves. They've taken the ability of the covered entity to, bill the retail price, bill the retail, keep the delta. Instead, the state is swooping in. They're taking the resources. So the state's getting the discount, and then they want to increase rebates on the back end.
Do they say that they will still give you some sort of pass-through?
So at the end of this process, there is no revenue. The state has been in conversations with us. I've had several conversations with the state myself, in which they've said that they want to make everybody whole, all the covered entities across the state. The reality is, if you talk to folks in California who went through a similar thing, as soon as there were budget issues, that fund was the first thing to go. And if you talk to a covered entity in California today, they still have not received a cent of this. So I think it's very dangerous. It's December today. This fiscal cliff, this goes in motion on April. So there's nothing the state has done to prepare for this. There's no mechanism in place. So there is no mechanism to make us whole.
So you are not able to avoid the change, but you want some sort of assurance that the money's in a lockbox, that it's not rateable.
Right. And unfortunately, only, that's a budgetary issue. The Department of Health doesn't have the ability to set aside indefinite, sums of money for safety net providers.
What is the state's rationale? I imagine they're arguing that if they bring it in-house, as it were, that they can then save money and not necessarily cut anything from your budget.
Sure. I think one of the state's arguments, of course, they want to increase transparency. They want to, increase the amount of rebates that they're able to get on some of these drugs. They want a single formulary. And the reality is that we have looked and we have worked across other states. There are other states that have had similar wants and needs and have come up with a way to not decimate the safety net to achieve that. And I think that's one of the struggles is we continually try to work, with the Department of Health and, of course, the Hochul administration. When the top shooting happened in East Buffalo, we got a call from Kathy Hochul's office, and I pulled in Akua Menzidou, our Chief People and Diversity Officer, and we had a conversation.
Sure. We've had her on the program.
Sure. And they said, what do you need, to continue to provide primary care? And we had a great conversation. At the end, I said, it's very simple what we need. When we look at how we're achieving increasing patient services and adding patient services and increasing wraparound things, we need the 340B program. We need you to delay or reverse the carve-out. We need to figure something else out. And their response to me was, yep, we're aware of it. And that was the end of the conversation. So I do think, this program is the one thing that's propping up safety net providers across Buffalo. Everybody, Community Health Center Buffalo, Jericho Road, Neighborhood Health Center, Chautauqua Center, we're all in the same boat where this will decimate us.
Why does it matter? Talk to me a little bit about the mission of Evergreen or similarly situated community health centers.
And one of the reasons this is a big deal when we talk about the managed care plans and the Medicaid folks, 70% of our patients are on a managed care plan. So the state swooping in and removing the 340B benefit basically wipes away the benefit for safety net providers. When we talk about things like dental services, when we talk about behavioral health services, mental health, substance use, pantry services, transportation, safety net providers know that those ancillary wraparound services are vital. Somebody that has HIV, we can say all you have to do to live a happy, normal life is take this pill once a day. But that doesn't happen if they don't have a place to live, if they don't have transportation to their medical appointments, if they are having dental problems. And addressing those ancillary needs are really what get us the great health outcomes. And those aren't reimbursed by any healthcare plan. And if we lose those resources and they're not reimbursed, there's nothing else. We have no choice but to cut services at that point. There's no other option.
And the nature of these providers, you would argue, is basically underserved populations, period.
This carve out by the state targets only safety net providers. When I said that we all of us have, whether it's Evergreen, Jericho Road, we all serve a very high percentage of traditionally underserved, historically marginalized populations. This carve-out only impacts that safety net. This carve-out only applies to them, and it disproportionately impacts them. We're talking about communities of color, people living with HIV, LGBT folks. These are folks that stand to lose the most in this carve-out because the folks like Evergreen, who provide a great deal of care to these folks on Medicaid managed care plans, are going to be severely impacted the most.
This might be the point to pause and get a little bit of background on who Evergreen is and who they serve.
So Evergreen Health was born out of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and of course, as HIV responded to antiretrovirals, we continued to grow. We continued to grow and serve a lot of LGBTQ population, people living with HIV, communities of color, most recently the intellectually and developmentally disabled, when we took over Aspire, and People Inc.'s primary care. So these are all patient populations that either our folks can't serve or don't want to serve, and Evergreen has got a niche.
One of the lobbying points that I've seen you have is that a policy that only negatively impacts those in need you say is not equitable and will harm Western New Yorkers. There's a population here that you feel is being targeted?
Absolutely. There's not a doubt in my mind, and I think it's really upsetting. The community health centers and FQHCs and Ryan White providers, we all provide care to a high margin, a high rate of disenfranchised populations, a high Medicaid population. So if you have the state and you're saying, we're going to take this benefit away from the safety net population, from the folks that are on a managed care plan, by taking this away from the Medicaid populations, the folks that, the disenfranchised populations we serve, it harms them the most. They're the ones that are going to lose services. We're not talking about people that are, going to a private practice or something like that, or that have commercial insurance. We're talking about people that have high rates of poverty, chronic illness, and everything else.
Let's then take that a step further, look at some of the examples of how that plays out, particularly at a place like Evergreen. One of your clients is here. Liza, thanks for stopping by.
Thank you for having me.
What does this mean to you?
Whoa. So it means a lot to me. This can affect me personally because I'm a person living with HIV. I've been living with HIV for 28 years.
And you take daily medication for it that would disappear, perhaps, if this goes ahead?
Absolutely. Well, actually, I'm on a newer medication that's an injectable medication that I get every 2 months. But yes, I have to have that medication.
Why do you need Evergreen? Why can't you just walk into, I don't know, your pharmacy and say, hey, I need my injectable now, realizing that injectable is not something you do at home, but to what degree is Evergreen your sole provider?
You said something about why I can't just go to the pharmacy. Well,
or another doctor, a different provider that isn't
different-
necessarily linked to this
Correct.
funding stream.
my experience is that there are not many providers that are willing to work with people like me. And when I say people like me, I mean people that are living with HIV, someone who has a history of substance abuse. I used to be an IV drug user. I have been in recovery for 24 years. So when that history comes up, it has always been my experience that providers treat me differently and they don't give me the care that I deserve.
Tell me more about that. Give me a personal story.
Oh, okay. I have a few, but I had to have an eye thing done one time. And at that point in my life, I was not comfortable with sharing openly about my status, but I would with medical providers. And I did
Sure.
with this eye doctor. He was going to do a surgery procedure. I did not put it on the paperwork. I wanted to discuss that with the doctor one-on-one. And he got very upset at me because I didn't put it on the paperwork.
Really?
And he told me that that's dangerous and I shouldn't be doing that. And I was hurt, and that's stigmatizing.
But it's not as if at that point in the discussion he had started a procedure.
No,
There
it
was no risk of contamination.
No.
Nothing that would put him at risk.
absolutely not. It was me. I wanted to talk to him one-on-one in person because he was the provider, and I understood that he would have to keep that confidential. I just wasn't comfortable with putting that on paper at the time.
All right. And is that the kind of thing that drove you to a provider like Evergreen?
Well, that's one of the things that Evergreen, they treat me as a person. They don't treat me as a person living with HIV, right? They have helped me with housing. Recently, as 7 years ago, I left a long-term relationship. Even with a job, it was difficult to find decent housing that was affordable. I did not have the money for a security deposit, and Evergreen came through for me.
You said you don't like being seen as a person living with HIV, but I think part of the benefit for me during this discussion is to, quite frankly, look at the experiences of a person living with HIV. So how
Absolutely.
often have you been discriminated against because of your status?
There's been many opportunities, and it's just not the HIV status. The fact that I have a drug use history has also been held against me. I'm a convicted felon. That has been held against me. So I've had like almost 3 strikes against me where when I come to Evergreen, I'm just Liza. I need medical care. I need dental care. I need pharmacy help. I may need housing. I don't know. One day I might need the food pantry.
Talk to me about the cost involved here. Let's say you did not have Evergreen or some of the other options that we're talking about within this context. Would you be able to still get those services, but at a different price? Or for you is the issue forgive me, the humanity, the idea that they, again, look at you as a person and give you the kind of treatment that you deserve. Is there a financial part of it, or is it just a ease and comfort thing?
I think
Lack of
it's
discrimination.
I think it's a little bit of both, right? So me personally, I do have a job. I do get health care through my employer. Actually, I work at Evergreen, right? But everybody, I remember there was a time when I was on Medicaid myself, and Evergreen was my lifesaver at that time. They still are because they are my medical provider also.
Okay.
So it's a little bit of both. It's financial, and it's also
Attitudinal.
yes, it's stigmatized, the stigma behind it, right? Again, it's very difficult to find providers that will just take care of me because that's what they're supposed to do and not really them taking everything else into account.
Before you found Evergreen, were you with just a basic standard private practice provider?
Well, I actually go back to Mike mentioned about the history of Evergreen, and I was with them. Like I said, I've been living with HIV for 28 years. So back in the day, I was with Evergreen.
How far back? Let's go back. How far? When were you first? When did you first find out that you were HIV positive?
So it was 1994. I'm sorry, 1994. And it was a short time after that I was referred to Evergreen. And there was a time where I was also at ECMC because they do provide HIV care there also.
Okay. I got to think that the attitudes then were different than they are today.
Oh, definitely. You know, I talk about this a lot. Not only am I HIV, a person living with HIV, but my father died in 1984 in New York City, and he had AIDS when he died. So I've been seeing this thing from day one. And I've seen how far we've come, and I'm also see that if this carve out happens, that we will probably take 10 steps backwards, and it's going to hurt people.
Liza, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
And Mike, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Mike Lee is the Chief Operating Officer of Evergreen Health, Liza, one of their clients. We did reach out to Governor Hochul's office to ask specifically whether these groups will be hurt as much as they contend. It comes in a statement from the New York State Department of Health, and here it is. The state fiscal year 2021 budget delayed the transition of pharmacy services from managed care back into fee-for-service to April 1, 2023. The transition is expected to result in a more efficient pharmacy reimbursement process, better consumer experience, they say, and higher rebates from drug manufacturers. The 340B program is a federal program that is not being eliminated. The Department of Health is working out with the impacted groups and is committed to ensuring a smooth transition.
We close now with Bishop Michael Badger from the Urban Think Tank in Buffalo and the Bethesda World Harvest International Church.
Before the program, we were talking in general about the East Side and about the conversation that needs to be had. And you crystallized it. You summarized it really well when you said, we don't need benevolence, we need investment.
Absolutely. The reason why the community looks like it does is the divestment that happened over the last 50 years. And so to change that, you need investment. You don't need benevolence takes care of an immediate need, but long term, you're still faced with the same circumstances. And so what we need in our community is those that are willing to come in and partner and recognize that there is business opportunities that can benefit everybody involved.
6 months after the shooting, are we stuck on benevolence, or is there still a need for that and the investment?
I think there's still a need for both, but I think that the latter is the most important. I think you have to change the demographics. While we need, low and medium income housing, you cannot just put poor people on top of poor people and then expect box stores and others to come just out of goodwill. They're coming because they want to make money. That's why they're in business. So in order to do that, you need the type of demographics that will support, a Wegmans or a Walgreen or some of the other box stores.
I don't want to parse your words, but let me probe more into this idea of benevolence versus investment.
Yeah.
Is there a lack of investment because there is a lack of benevolence? Is it intrinsic racism that people are not necessarily aware of?
There might be some of that, but I think a lot of it just is ignorance. Not understanding, the plight of what has happened in East Buffalo or the East Side, however you want to phrase that, and recognizing that it didn't get there by itself.
Yeah.
It got there because intentionally you put a throughway through the middle of it and ruined a beautiful park. You took away a lot of the opportunities, and so when you had Bethlehem Steel and Republic Steel and Chevy and all of those places go, and then there was no investment made to ensure that housing and other things were kept up. This is what you get. You get the third poorest city in the country. It wasn't always that way. It happened through a series of events. Now, whether that was intentional, I'm not prepared to say that it was intentional.
The intent of the Kensington was to connect two
yes,
areas.
That was intentional.
Without awareness of the fact they were splitting a neighborhood? Or was it just a matter of we don't care, the throughway needs to go
I think
here?
in that case we don't care.
Yeah.
Because we're going to make it easy to get in and out of the city to our jobs. And here's the interesting thing, the investments that were made, Amherst didn't get to be Amherst because people were smarter. They got to be Amherst because you decided to take the University of Buffalo and build it
And
out
put
there,
it there.
And build all the infrastructure with tax dollars to make that happen. Had UB been built downtown like it was supposed to, we're talking about a totally different city. Had the stadium or the rapid transit had not just been down Main Street like it and went to other places, there were so many mistakes that were made because a couple of individuals decided what was going to be best for them and didn't look at the whole of this community.
You are in an interesting position. You have the facility there on Main Street near Utica. You're talking about investment, and to a large degree, you have put your money where your mouth is. You are a landlord for retail business along Main Street.
Yeah, it's interesting, Dave. When I came back to Buffalo from Charlotte in January of 1990, it's been 32 years, our church, which was the old Regency Theater, historically, a little bit of information, the last silent movie was played at that theater. So it was an old building that looked like it should have been condemned. And we put $3.5 million into that building, revitalized it, changed it. And then the building next door to us that would take us to East Utica was in disrepair. We talked to the owner of it. He sold it to us. And we redid that building. And now we're putting some affordable apartments upstairs. We've got commercial space downstairs. So altogether, we've invested over $5 million on that main East Utica Square area right there.
Is it easy for businesses to set up shop? Even and everyone says Jefferson, but let's look at that that desolate stretch of Main Street. Is it easy for businesses to set up shop there?
I think there's an opportunity for business, but it has its challenges because of, you're looking at the busiest subway station in the city right there at Main and Utica. And there's a lot of traffic that happens there. And we have some challenges because of drug treatment centers and different things like that. But I still think that there's great opportunity for business right there because of the amount of people that visit that area every day.
I think of the first President George Bush and his whole idea of 1,000 points of light. The idea was that volunteer groups and faith groups and people out there make those 1,000 points of light, that it didn't necessarily have to be government. That's kind of what you're doing with the church, isn't it?
Absolutely. I believe that the true gospel has to impact outside of the four walls, or what does it mean to the community? If you're talking about reaching out and making a difference, if it's just in the four walls, then why are you necessary? I think you have to be able to impact outside of the four walls of the church to really be what Jesus preached and taught.
Does that absolve the government for not doing enough?
No, the government must play its part. Let's face it, we don't have the type of dollars that government has. But I think government shouldn't exclude faith-based organizations from being a part, because those are we pay taxes too. And so,
Wait a minute. Churches don't pay taxes.
Churches don't, but the people in them do.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, and then the mission that we do of feeding, of clothing, of like this. Right now, my wife and I'm making this announcement, but our upstairs, our multi-purpose room is filled with toys. I mean, literally filled from top to bottom with toys that we'll give away to hundreds of families in the next 2 weeks. So, those are things that we do every year. We, during Thanksgiving, we feed families. We have Coke giveaways. All of that. We spend our own money to do that, as well as we work with other groups to do that. All of that happens because there is a mission that says, we need to be our brother's keeper.
And I think in all the analysis of the things that have happened since the shootings on 5/14, there's been a lot of discussion about the tight-knit nature of the East Side. The fact that there is, not that the church isn't part of it, but the fact that there is a pre-existing strong sense of community.
Yeah, well, Buffalo is a big family. I guarantee you that when you meet someone, if you talk long enough, somebody that they know, or their kin. When we look at those the Buffalo 10 that lost their lives, I remember Miss Whitfield. Garnell and Robin and I went to School 90 together, Genesee Humble together. We were childhood friends, and I remember Miss Whitfield as being one of the mothers of the community. And when we were growing up, people like Miss Whitfield would correct you. Say, boy, you better stop doing that. You get away from that. You know what I'm saying? They took ownership of the fact that we were all their children.
And in your congregation, there are a lot of people that knew the 10.
Oh, absolutely. Everybody knew somebody.
Yeah.
Or had family that were a part of that. Yeah.
How's the community doing? Is there still grief? Or I go back to your earlier premise. Now is the time for benevolence, investment rather than benevolence.
Yeah.
Do we still have people who are grieving and suffering and hurting?
I would definitely say to the families that lost loved ones, and to even those that saw that, absolutely, there is still the process of grief that is happening. I think for many people, there is now the issue. Okay, what is going to happen out of this that will make this tragedy turn into some type of triumph?
People you think are ready to turn that corner?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. I think that needs to happen in order to give some sense that this was just, that people didn't just